thank Georgie for the invitation to be with you today. Can you hear me all right? It was only 2 days after the election of now Pope Francis that we, as Georgie and I were dialoguing about the series of presentations and what theme to take. And so it occurred to me, Francis and the Papacy is a good theme. Even though it's a little ambiguous, exactly what that may mean. And we'll explore a little of that right now. Have any of you ever been to Assisi? Those who have, you'll recognize this as the basilica in which St. Francis is buried. In the upper basilica, actually there are two churches there, you can't see the lower one. He's buried in the lower one. If I move around a little, does that help? Otherwise you can't see. Maybe that's better. In the upper basilica, which was completed, at least the structure, about 1238. Francis died in 1226. 1238. It was decorated over the centuries. And right at the end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, the school of Giotto illustrated the life of St. Francis in 28 frescoes that go around the perimeter of the nave of the church. And those 28 frescoes, they correspond to, they are actually an illustration of the life of St. Francis according to the writing of St. Bonaventure. Bonaventure wrote two biographies of St. Francis, and the longer one, that's the one that is illustrated in the upper basilica in Assisi. And I thought I would use this as a point of departure today to help convey something about St. Francis's relationship with the papacy. That came out pretty well, I think you can see that. This is not necessarily in chronological order. I've chosen this one because this represents the Pope. He's seated in the middle with his rather deliberate look, looking at St. Francis, who is preaching. This is a segment from the chapter on Francis's efficacy as a preacher. And what happened behind this scene is that Francis had prepared an eloquent sermon. And he came in rather nervous. He had been prompted by the Cardinal of Ostia, Cardinal Ugolino, to preach to Pope Honorius III and other dignitaries. So he comes in to preach this wonderful homily, and he's standing there in front of them, and his mind goes completely blank. He can't remember a thing. And he's a simple man, and he simply says, I went blank. I can't remember a thing. So he just waited, and he said, I'm just going to pray to the Holy Spirit. So he did. And then he started preaching. And they were spellbound at what he was saying. That's the context. But I want to draw your attention to some of the artwork here. Look at the individual as we are looking at this. To the right of Honorius III. Well, look at his foot. I'm going to point to it now.
I can see.
Looks like a horse's hoof, doesn't it? Well, better to call that individual a horse's hoof than another part of the human anatomy. It speaks to the conflict at times between Francis and some of the established church of his day. I say that here with great caution, okay? And as you can see, I've titled this frame, Dealing with Biases. The most renowned historian of St. Francis in the English-speaking world is John Mormon, an Anglican bishop who died towards the end of the last century. He's got a bias. Here you have St. Francis, who's a wonderful example of an individual filled with the Spirit who is encountering a church greatly in need of reform and comes across a little bit as a rebel. And perhaps, if you're of Anglican background, this might be appealing to see St. Francis in an antithetical relationship with Rome. There was another biographer, a Frenchman, actually, who started this whole question of a bias in writing and depicting the life of St. Francis, Paul Sabatier, a French Huguenot, who actually took all of the high-powered critical reflection on the life of Christ and that trying to get at who is really the Jesus as we find him in the Gospels. Well, as we read the little flowers of St. Francis, you know, the Francis preaching to the birds, feeding the birds, all these very romantic notions, he said, well, who's the real Francis in back of that? You write a biography of yourself, or rather, if you write a biography of someone, it says as much about you as it does the person you're writing about, because of your perspective. We all have biases. So I would invite today that we simply try to put a parenthesis around whatever bias. I have a bias as a Roman Catholic. We all have biases. So if we just try to put a parenthesis around that for a moment to see what might be this little poor man of Assisi and his relationship with the Roman pontiff. This is a scene from the early life of St. Francis. And it's a dream. I'm going to show you the next slide. They kind of go together, and then I'm going to come back to this one. That's the same pontiff, the same pope in this picture. But this moment is preparatory to the action depicted in the one I just took off the screen. The one I took off the screen was the approval on the part of the Pope of the way of life of St. Francis. Okay. He wrote a rule, we call it, his rule of life. And we don't have that original rule. It doesn't exist in any manuscript form at this point in time. It's lost entirely. But it would seem to have been a collection of gospel passages that really strike to the core of a radical living of the gospel. And so what Francis did was he came to Rome with his original 12 companions, and he's seeking approval of this way of life. Now this is and I say a radical way of living. Francis and the companions that he came to the Vatican with were dressed in beggar garb and very simple. And they were really a spiritual group, part of a movement, an expression of a movement that was quite common at the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century. A radical living of the gospel, trying to get back to a very simple lifestyle. It was a group, there were numerous groups. There were the Waldensians, followers of Peter Waldo of Lyon, whose influence had greatly entered into the northern part of Italy and had begun to come down the peninsula. This was a group who were advocating a rather strict way of living, a group that was very discontent with the misbehavior of the clergy at the time, distrustful of the clergy. Parallel to this group, not the same, but in a similar vein, similar spirit, were the Cathars in the south of France, a group that had a little bit of a dualistic view of the world. Spirit is good, but there's something inherently wrong with matter, materialism. In fact, they posited that goodness is the principle for the spirit, and the principle behind matter was evil. So there was a distrust of things material. Well, if you're a sacramental church and you distrust matter, it's hard to baptize something with something that is matter, or bread and wine, or oil. And so the Cathars categorically rejected the sacraments. And they were exerting a very wide influence very much in the south of France, but also spread to other areas as well. So Francis, his movement is emerging in a context where there is some serious suspicion of these kinds of movements. And so the Pope, when Francis first presented himself, was distrustful of Francis's position. He had his doubts. He reasoned that this man wants to live the gospel very radically. Well, can he do this? And if he gives approval to a group that falls flat on its face shortly after it's approved, it would be more of an embarrassment than a help. So he basically tells Francis, go away and pray about this for a while, and then come back. So Francis comes back, and through a series of conversations, he eventually wins the Pope's approval. But the Pope confided, I had a dream, and you were in my dream. And that's what's depicted in this particular fresco. The Pope, on the right-hand side, is asleep. And he's dreaming, and he sees a young, poorly clad individual in simple medieval garb who is propping up the Lateran Basilica. And the Lateran is the cathedral of Rome. And it's falling. It was in disrepair. And the Pope sees Francis propping that up. Innocent III, incidentally, an extremely powerful medieval pope, probably the pinnacle of medieval, the highest of the most powerful of the popes certainly in the 13th century, this high medieval period. An individual, when Stephen Langton was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, and that was disputed. Innocent III persuaded King John to eventually see things the way he wanted them to be seen. He was a pope who was reclaiming territory in the south of Italy from the emperor at the time. He also put pressure on Philip Augustus, King of France, in his relationship with his wife, and also influenced Spain. A very, very powerful man. A canon lawyer by professional training, who also had a profound interest in the reform of the church at that time. And this is the man who's responsible for having called the Fourth Lateran Council, a council that not only called for the reformation of the clergy, but it also wanted to bring the people back to the celebration of the sacraments. It's from Innocent III that the Easter duty comes, the obligation to receive communion at least once a year, and to go to confession once during the Easter season, and to go to confession at least once a year. You see, he's trying to bring people back to the sacraments. He's the Pope who is also very sympathetic to the inclinations of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, we'll see, who come to preach the gospel. He wants something to counter the doctrinal, what he considered the doctrinal abuses at the time. So when Francis walks in to get his rule approved, he recognizes him as the man that was in his dream. And here we see depicted Innocent III, who is giving back to Francis the rule, short writing, and blessing him and his followers to go out and preach and to live a simple way of life. The Pope had a dream of reforming the church, and Francis had a vision during which the image of Christ on the cross said, "Rebuild my church." This is the beginning of a charismatic man in the person of Francis, who meets the height of institution, and they manage to work together. It's the beginning of a relationship with the papacy. It's not your eyes as to the quality of this slide, okay? This is a fresco that unfortunately is positioned right below a window that there's been a lot of water damage done to the fresco on account of it being leaked. Here we have, in this particular fresco, the third of the popes that Francis was affiliated with. The second one is Honorius III. He was the one that Francis was preaching to, the first slide that I showed you. Also of a background in institutional affairs. As you know, the Franciscan movement, the number of friars grew exponentially. It's a movement that spoke to people's hearts, the simplicity of lifestyle, a withdrawing oneself from the terrible vices that were gripping people in terms of abusive power and avarice, greed. So it spoke to people, and it grew very, very quickly. To give you an idea, in 1209, when Francis went to Rome for the approval of his rule, there were 12 followers with him. Already by about 1219, by even the minimal estimate, there were over 3,000 friars that were following his movement. And by 1260, by the time the friars had arrived at a much greater point, there were close to 60,000 friars. So within a very short period of time, this movement just grew very quickly. And as it grew, it's one thing, even in a household when you're alone, right? You open the fridge, the refrigerator, put the milk on the top shelf. The next time you come, you find it on the top shelf exactly where you left it. You get married and you find out that the milk is in two places all of a sudden. Right? By the time you have 60,000 followers, you can't even find the milk. You don't know where it is. Numbers necessarily give birth to some kind of organization. Honorius III was Pope at the moment when this movement was growing very, very quickly. And he persuaded, imposed on Francis some steps in discerning the Spirit in the lives of his followers. It is Honorius III who insisted on the introduction of a novitiate, a year when a person first senses a call to live in this particular way of life, but a year of intense reflection during which time the decision is made if that's the right way of life. But you see that was introduced, that was not originally part of the picture. It became. We have Francis in dialogue with the institutional church, and Francis accepting the suggestions and the recommendations. And it didn't come easy. I mentioned the first rule that Francis had, and of which we have no surviving manuscripts. Well, his second rule was proposed to the Pope and to Honorius III, and he looked at it and he said, "Nice try. This simply will not do." It just was filled with just biblical passages kind of strung together, connected. And the Pope said, "It's beautiful thought and spirituality, but it's not going to serve your purposes as a rule of life, practical guidelines." And he introduced him to a canon lawyer, a friend of his, and they went back and worked on a rule, and 2 years later it was presented, and it was eventually approved. I say this to indicate that it was very much a dialogue between this charismatic movement that as it grew and took on shape, it did so in dialogue with the powers at hand. And there were some compromises that were made along the way in order to work things out. This particular fresco is the moment when St. Francis is being canonized a saint, being named among the saints. And it's in this church no longer exists in Assisi for those who were there. It's the Church of St. George. And that's a depiction of Francis having been buried 2 years previous under the altar. And the Pope is this one back here who you can't see, flanked by some bishops and some friars, and they came to the church for his canonization. This was in July 15th of 1228. And Gregory the Ninth is this pope. And Gregory, too, is a reformer. And Gregory had known Francis from his early days. In fact, Gregory, prior to becoming pope, was the cardinal who the pope had appointed to give oversight to the group, as a group. So he was very familiar with the issues that the growth of the community was undergoing. And this pope, Gregory, knew that in the person of St. Francis, he had a wonderful example of an individual who lived the gospel profoundly and did it in a way that was attractive to others. In fact, it was contagious. He was a man who proclaimed the gospel by his way of life. And he wanted to use this wonderful example, now being made a saint, to get the message across. He did two things within a week's time of this canonization. He commissioned the building of the basilica in a season, knowing that it would be, hoping that it would be providing the land for the and providing, making sure that a large enough church would be built, one that would attract pilgrims, that would bring people to it. A church that eventually would be decorated in such a way that people could see the life of this man as they came to venerate his remains. And he did one other thing as well. He commissioned one of the friars named Thomas of Celano to write the first biography of St. Francis. Now, so many people could not read, so you see he covered the bases. There'd be a biography, a written text, to help get out the message of who this Francis was, and a church where his remains are, and that would be beautifully decorated in such a way, the poor man's Bible, where the frescoes would tell the story, where those who couldn't read would still could learn who this Francis was. And so we have this moment when Gregory canonizes St. Francis. But we have another moment as well. And this is after Francis is already dead. And Gregory, that's Gregory the Ninth, who is reclining, he's sleeping, he's dreaming. Gregory admitted that he knew Francis in his lifetime. Let me back up. 2 years before St. Francis died, he was making a retreat just in Tuscany. Assisi is in Umbria, just slightly north and a little bit to the west, just touching the confines of Tuscany. Francis had been loaned a piece of, it was a mountaintop, Laverne, where he often went just to get away and for extended spiritual retreats. So Francis goes to Laverne, and he's preparing for the feast of St. Michael. The feast of St. Michael was a principal feast, and Francis went to Laverne for a 2-year period, a 2-month period of fasting. And it was around the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, mid-September, so about 2 weeks before the feast of St. Michael, when Francis himself had a mystical experience, a moment when an an apparition. He had an apparition. And it appeared that a seraph, a six-winged angel, a seraph, appeared to him. And the wings were configured in such an image of Christ nailed to the cross. And as Francis meditated on this, the cross is absolutely central to Franciscan spirituality. And as Francis, deeply in love with our Lord, and so wanting to be identified with Christ, that the Lord blessed him with the marks of his own passion imprinted in his own flesh, the stigmata. Now, there were impressions in his hands and feet and side. This was not something that... Francis was a very modest man, very humble man. And this was something that he tried to conceal from others. There were a few people who knew it. From his side, he bled. And from his hands as well at times and feet. But he pretty much became a recluse. Retreated to mountaintops and caves where he spent prolonged periods in prayer at this time. But when he died, and his body was prepared for burial, the wounds in his flesh were very much made public. Gregory knew him in life. He says he witnessed to having seen the marks of the hands and feet. But Gregory also admitted that he had a little bit of a nagging doubt. He didn't really know whether Francis could have actually been given the wound in his side. So Gregory dreams. And Francis appears to him in his dream. And that's Francis just lifting his habit in such a way that it manifests the mark in his side, so as to resolve the doubt, Gregory's doubt, that he was given the gift of the stigmata. Francis and the Papacy is a 20-year love-hate relationship, in a way. You have a wonderfully charismatic individual in the person of Francis, who is very much a prophet in his own day, and who is the founder of the Order of Friars Minor, M-I-N-O-R, minor, lesser brothers, who believed that humility was the cornerstone of his movement. And even amongst the organization of the friars, no one would be called a superior. What we would say the local leader of the group is called the guardian. Even today, that's what we call the local superior, is called the guardian, the minister, the servant of the other brothers. So Francis is given this wonderful grace. A papacy very interested in reforming the church at its given moment sees the potential for this kind of spirituality and wants to harness it. So we have institution and charism coming together. Sometimes at odds. At one point in his life, Francis didn't know whether he should. He wanted to retreat to a mountain top full-time, take himself out of preaching altogether. And he was perplexed as to what to do. And so that he would not simply rely on his own judgment, he sent his friars to two people to consult with. One was St. Clare. So the friars went to St. Clare and they said, Francis is deliberating between should he continue to be a preacher or should he embark on a contemplative life altogether. Right? He sent another pair of friars to Friar Sylvester with the same charge to ask their prayers and advice. Time passes, the message comes in from Clare, preach. The message comes in from Sylvester, preach. Francis is disappointed. It's not what he wanted to hear, but he preaches. Spirituality, individual promptings of God's Spirit, service of a church, a gift given so that it is placed at the service of others in and through an ecclesial organization. This is a built-in tension, is it not? Doesn't have to be, but it often is. I don't know how many people I've heard say to me at different points, I'm profoundly spiritual, and I have no doubt that they are. But I don't ascribe to any established religion, because I don't want that institutional structure, the constraints, the harness. There's various things I don't agree with in any of the structure, so I don't want to go there. But that gift remains rather insular, perhaps. And yet, on the other hand, there are individuals who feel profoundly spiritual, enter into institutionalized religion, and before you know it, they're mediocre. They've leveled, and they don't seem to get the gift of the Spirit back in their hearts ever again. It's a tension, isn't it? To live in such a way that one responds to the promptings of God's Spirit, to live in such a way that those graces and those gifts can be shared with the greatest number of people. There's the wager that Francis lived throughout his life. And it becomes a visual in his relationship with the papacy, Francis and the papacy. Well, you're not going to get this one. If we're not going to get it, I'm not going to leave that up there. Had that appeared, right? It's a picture of today's Pope. Okay, Pope Francis I. They say when he was elected, sitting at the conclave, that there was a Franciscan cardinal from Rio de Janeiro next to him. And at the moment when he was elected, he simply said to him, he said, "Don't forget the poor. Don't forget the poor." And the Pope reflected later. He makes, at a split second, he makes some decisions, all right? So he comes up with the St. Francis. And later, he connects. He told me not to forget the poor. He went back to Francis. In the person of the current Pope, we have an interesting moment. It's obviously too soon to see where his leadership is going to take us. But an individual who's not afraid to get on a bus in Buenos Aires to go back and forth to work and to be with people is an indicator already. A man who at the moment of his having been elected and being presented to the world, who asks people to pray with him before he leads them in prayer, spoke volume as far as his style of understanding leadership and to be respectful of the operation of God's Spirit in the hearts of faithful. different way of exercising leadership. Good, that one is back. I mentioned Francis had a vision early in his life. An image from the image of the crucifix in disrepair. He hears a voice that says, "Francis, rebuild my church. You see, it's falling to pieces." He's in a little chapel called San Damiano. That's the name of that church, St. Damien. And you can see from the depiction, it's dilapidated, and there's holes in the roof. And this is when his vocation is beginning to crystallize. Repair my church. And the rest of his life are moments in which he is repairing God's church in various ways, through his preaching, through a virtuous life, an authentic, coherent way of life that corresponds to the belief structures that he had. This is the power of his spirituality. It's everyday spirituality. As St. Bonaventure wrote this Life of St. Francis, there are 7 instances in which the cross plays a prominent role. This is one of them. Such that the 7th, when we get to the stigmata, and the impressing of the wounds of the crucified Christ in the body of Francis. Well, that's not just as if it came all of a sudden. No, it was a 20-year period of the grace of baptism. Are you not aware that we who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death, St. Paul says. So that in living, believing in that Christ, then we share the fruits of his resurrection. Well, Francis is growing at that invitation to be crucified with Christ over a 20-year period. The stigmata, the appearance of the wounds, is simply at that point in his life the grace of approval. It's an external manifestation of the interior reality that had already taken place. Man has been transformed. He's put on Christ. He resembles Christ. And now he's being given a visual way of that being seen. And that was such an important aspect in people coming to the Basilica of Assisi to be drawn to the same charism, to be attracted to the same spirituality, a spirituality that encompasses a person's life, the day in and the day out. Not magic, nothing magical about it at all, but living authentically. It's daily spirituality. It's ordinary spirituality. It's seeing the beauty of God's creation and everything around us and being enlivened by that. And the Pope we have today is talking about needing to rebuild a church. He takes the name Francis, whose message to him was, rebuild my church. Well, we can all hear that message. It's addressed to each and every one of us, to be built up to become those living stones of the heavenly New Jerusalem, to put on Christ in that way. Okay. Well, that's pretty much what I have prepared for today. I thank you for your attention. Sure.
If a friend would like to comment or ask a question, please wait for me to come with the microphone so that we can all hear what you have to say.
growing up Catholic, growing up to Francis, what would he have said if he realised a basilica with all that money and wealth had been built in his name?
Well, that's a very good question, first of all. And it's one that has often been asked about that. And it speaks directly to this question about the tension between his individual gift and grace and its operation in a larger institutional structure. The church, first of all, belongs to the popes. The land still belongs to the pope, and those churches are papal facilities, and they technically belong to the pope. You know, the friars, we bitterly over what gospel simplicity meant, even while Francis was still alive. This is a man who tried to lead this group, all right, and realized he had to step down as the leader of the group because it was out of his control, in a sense. He wanted something more simple. He realized that people who wanted to follow his way of life and yet couldn't do it the same way he did it, this was causing tremendous tension within the community. So what did the community do? They went to Rome and asked, how should we understand our world? How can we interpret it? So the papacy answered the question. But that opened the door. And the papacy has always felt comfortable in telling us how to live our lives. And we asked for it, and we've gotten it. And this is probably the first instance of that. He bought the land, he commissioned the building of the church, and he wanted his remains put there. And he had it decorated. Is it consistent with everything about which Francis? Does it represent Francis? His lifestyle while on earth? Maybe not. Is it an attempt to represent Francis, the glorified saint? Perhaps. I don't know. But it is an excellent question.
I just have two simple comments about Pope Francis. The first is that I think it's rather striking that I think I'm right in saying he's in fact the first Jesuit Pope, and his, as it were, deflecting that by taking the name Francis, and specifically making the point that it is Francis of Assisi and not Francis Xavier, is very striking. And the second is that he is also clearly a very gifted preacher. His sermon at this institution was tremendously powerful while being very simple.
Let me just comment on the first observation you made as a Jesuit. Near the end of the 18th century, there was a Franciscan pope, a conventual Franciscan, Clement XIV, who suppressed the Jesuits. And he's a good pope. He's forgiven us. In the selection of the name, I think in and of itself, he's made a wonderful overture in the selection of the name on many counts.
I don't think we have time for any more questions, but I would just like to make an observation about the Pope, and that's that, particularly after hearing what you had to say about the dialogue, it seems to me that he is embodying the dialogue between the church and the institution and his own way of life, because there's no doubt his humility is transparently huge. And I find that very impressive and very helpful. So we've come to the end of this wonderful talk and the end of the series I would like to thank you all for coming. Many of you have been loyal supporters week after week, and despite the cold at the beginning of the sixth term. As I said at the beginning, next term it will be, hopefully anyway, Celtic spirituality. But what I would like to emphasise with the 3 series that we've had so far is that they were not designed to be academic lectures in the sense of, oh, that's interesting. They were specifically aimed in the hope that people who came would take on board these little bits and pieces from all 3 of these major spiritualities and incorporate them into your own lives. And I hope that it has been successful in that aim. Certainly it has for me. So thank you for coming. Please feel free to support us if you can, financially, and watch this space. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much indeed.